Thank you for listening to this PYA webinar recast. PYA is pleased to offer this alternative way to access our thought leadership. This is a recording of a previously delivered webinar. The information is accurate as of the date of the original event. The video recording, slides, and associated material for this and all PYA webinars are available on our website at pyapc.com. This podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be used as legal advice or an official opinion.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by PYA. Today, we are continuing our timely, tough, or tricky physician compensation and fair market value topics series with a presentation on the solar eclipse, bringing your FMV and physician compensation questions out of the shadows. PYA is happy to present today's webinar on this important topic. With that, I would like to introduce PYA Principal Lyle Oelrich and Consulting Manager Aaron Newcomer. Both Lyle and Aaron consult with physician practices, hospitals, and healthcare systems in the areas of fair market value compensation and commercial reasonableness. Lyle and Aaron have many years of experience in these areas, as well as advising physicians and hospitals with other strategic, financial, and operational issues, such as physician compensation models. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lyle Oelrich.
Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon to many of you, and to some, good morning. We are so thankful that you are able to join Aaron and I here today as we play a little bit on the most recent eclipse that occurred earlier this month, and wanting to bring some of the most significant fair market value and physician compensation topics out of the shadows, so to speak, for each of you. And we're really excited about this webinar. It's building off of the first webinar in the 2024 series that we had on the top 10 in-demand physician specialties. And these are questions that we're going to cover here today that you'll see on the screen that came from our listeners as we began to survey each of you all as it relates to the top issues that you're facing as it relates to physician compensation and fair market value. So we're excited to talk about the most meaningful questions that are out there for you all. And so we're going to take each of these four questions here today, and we're going to provide our perspective on each first, and Aaron and I will take these one by one and alternate here. But then we're going to talk about how our clients are handling each of these questions. And, you know, it's actually a pretty difficult task to do. We're going to share our experience, certainly, and sort of clients, but it's really difficult to do knowing that we can't address every single specific set of facts and circumstances that are out there. So we may even talk about some of these topics, but if we talk about them in the employment situation, you may be thinking about how they need to be addressed from an independent contractor perspective. So forgive us if we can't address your specific scenario. We're always willing to get on the phone with any of you all and talk through these issues and provide our perspectives to you. But likewise, as you see these questions on here, if there are others that you have, please chat those in. We love to talk about the topics that are most meaningful to our listeners. And with that being said, if by chance you have missed any of our prior webinars, I'm going to ask the moderator to chat in a link to the Triple T webinar series. For those of you all who this might be the first time you've listened to this session, this is our third season. We typically do about 6 webinars per season. So I think there are 12 or 13 that are out there if you're interested. So with that being said, let's jump right in to the first question and talk about what types of compensation models are losing and or gaining momentum. So on the slide here, you're going to see a word cloud of many, but by no means all, of the various physician compensation models that are out there. So certainly we won't have a chance to talk about all of the models today and sort of their pluses and perhaps minuses, depending on how you look at it. And on top of that, each of these different models, you can combine them with each other if you've got different portions of a physician's compensation that might be based off of clinical versus admin versus call or some other component. So there's almost a limitless number of combinations that you can have here together, which to me makes physician compensation intriguing by itself. And the bottom line becomes, effectively, if you've seen one model, you've seen one model, because what may work with very similar circumstances may not work in the next for cultural or other differences as well. So before we kind of talk about the prevalence of the various physician compensation models, I want to give some perspective for where we're going to be coming from as we answer this question or provide our perspective on this question. So really, if I had to really narrow it down, physician compensation becomes a balancing act. And as I like to refer to it, it's balancing productivity, performance, and profitability. Or as you can see on this slide, what does productivity look like in comparison to quality and physician engagement, or simplicity versus flexibility? And then compensation that's paid effectively on an income statement as an expense versus the revenue that's coming in as well from each of these various compensation models. So which way are the scales tipping? And I think the data tells us that certainly models that focus on personal productivity of the physician, and namely work RVUs, continue to lead the pack. And we're seeing something around 7 out of 10 compensation models that are in the outpatient setting have work RVUs. In the inpatient setting, we see that less frequently, sometimes in the 4 out of 10 range. But even though, and I think this is an important part to stress for just a moment, even though the compensation models include work RVUs are not always the extent of the totality that determines physician compensation. And what I mean by that is you might have work RVUs in your physician compensation model, but you still have to figure out what fair market value compensation is for these particular physicians. And there have been studies, for example, by MGMA that shows that work RVUs are responsible for up to maybe 60% of a physician's compensation model. So that means 40% of a physician's compensation model is due to other determinants. Perhaps it's the physician's experience, expertise, years of experience, all sorts of various elements that go into that particular aspect. But I wanted to pause and just comment on that as well. We do see the use of quality incentives trending upwards. We're seeing that nearly in 1 out of 2 physician agreements now. But likewise, even though the frequency is growing, we're still only seeing about 5 to maybe up to 20% of a physician's compensation at risk, if you will, for meeting certain quality metrics. And at times that can be limited by the fee-for-service reimbursement environment. I think the highest sort of benchmark that I've seen out there related to quality and more is up to 27% of reimbursement coming from MIPS, but that's related to quality, cost, interoperability, and improvement activities. But that's just a general benchmark I think we keep in the back of our minds as we work on these particular arrangements. Also, sort of from our experience, I will say, work RVUs don't really come without their potential flaws or the need for changes from time to time. And we've seen that. You all, I'm sure, are very familiar with some of these models and how they've changed as a result of the significant work RVU value changes that occurred via CMS in 2021. Now we have G2211, which will likely add work RVUs to the consortium of work that's being performed by the physicians, and trying to figure out what that means for a work RVU compensation model. Many of you all are probably going through right now. Likewise, from a work RVU perspective, thinking about how work RVUs are paid for personally performed services. And this can get a bit complicated as you think about how physicians work collaboratively with APPs getting into things like the rendering versus the billing provider is something that can become significant as well. Finally, I'll mention one thing on the work RVU tiered models. And so that's where, for example, you might be paid $50 per work RVU for work RVUs, maybe up to 5,000. And then from 5,001 and on, you might get paid, say, $55 a work RVU. We're actually seeing those types of models beginning to lose some momentum. There were actually some changes in the 2022 Medicare physician fee schedule on the definition of indirect compensation arrangements, and when this is applicable in your situation, it's causing some regulatory potential concerns. Just thinking about how physician compensation might be tied to the volume or value of referrals or other business generated by the physicians. And so for some of that, and it might be mitigated by some other regulatory matters, we're seeing clients begin to step away from that particular model. Finally, two quick thoughts here. Team-based models are continuing to generate some momentum. Certainly some specialties this is more applicable to than others, and certainly OB/GYN is one of those. You want to continue to reward those physicians who are very productive, but at the same time, you want to make sure that they have the help that they need, given kind of the 24-hour nature of that particular specialty. And then finally, I'll say this, models that offer simplicity are gaining momentum. And I love this expression, but think of flexibility, which creates complexity, which negates simplicity. And so if you really pause and think about that, sometimes flexibility can get in the way, and it creates complexity when something that's more simple might be ultimately the better way to go. So I'm going to pause here and turn it over to Aaron to talk about the next question.
Thank you, Lyle. So we're getting into our second question here, which is how you reconcile the current rate of wage inflation with the time lag in published benchmarking surveys. So first, we want to explain what we mean by the published benchmarking surveys and the associated time lag. So currently, we're using 2023 surveys, which are based on data collected for 2022. So we're about a couple years out from the actual data that we're looking at. And that can create concerns for organizations that are using this survey data when they're making their compensation decisions. So we have some clients that will tie the rate of inflation to the survey data to increase it to account for that time lag. What we want to show you on the graph on the right in regard to this is the rate of inflation compared to the compound annual growth rate of physician compensation in a few different specialty groupings. So the dark blue bar on the right side of each section is the rate of inflation. So you'll see about 7% in 2021, 6.5% in 2022, and 3.5% in 2023. And then the other bars in the lighter blue to the left of that are the compound annual growth rate from year to year for primary care, surgical specialties, and non-surgical or medical specialties. So you'll see in 2021, we've got kind of the biggest differential. And again, there are going to be some COVID noise, some pandemic noise in that data, but you'll see a decrease in some of the physician compensation, and you'll see a really large rate of inflation compared to the changes in physician compensation. As you get into 2022 and 2023, they start to even out and become a little more similar, but still the rate of inflation is a little bit different than a lot of the specialty groupings. If you look at 2020, which is not in this graph, the rate of inflation was about 1.5%. So if we start tying the survey data to the rate of inflation, you can see where there's some differences and where you might get into some trouble trying to adjust the data. So what we want to talk about is other solutions to do this. The other thing we want to think about is how inflation might affect physician compensation. So especially in private practice, as inflation goes up, expenses are going to rise, and that may leave less for physician compensation. In hospital-owned practices, that effect might be lower just because of the possibility of cross-subsidization. but you still have this inverse relationship between inflation and physician compensation. So that's the problem with tying it all together. What are some of the solutions? So some of the things that we recommend and some things that we see our clients doing are developing policies where you look at physician compensation periodically and evaluate it based on a variety of factors that might include inflation. And you might look at this annually if it's a specific physician. You might look at a specialty group every 2 or 3 years. But when we think about what we want to look at when adjusting compensation, inflation is one factor. The other factor are the regional and local market dynamics. That can include the cost of living. So if you're in California, that might be a bigger factor than if you're in Atlanta, where I am, or if you're somewhere else that's closer to the national average. That can also include other offers from competitors. So we hear a lot of times physicians talking about not being able to recruit because a practice down the street is offering more compensation, or they're getting offers in their email for other positions where compensation is higher. And that's important to be aware of from the local market perspective. It's important to verify those. It's also important to be aware of specialty supply and demand. We got into this a little bit in our last Triple T webinar. We talked about the top 10 specialties. But specialties we are having a hard time recruiting and retaining providers. Maybe specialties where you need to offer higher compensation. And there may be specialties where there's more movement that you need to look at outside of just inflation. Reimbursement trends. If Medicare is changing reimbursement for certain services, that's another indicator that the cost of providing those services might be going up. And then performance benchmarks is a really big one. So you may have a specialty where compensation is increasing. You might have competition in the local market, but you may have a physician in that specialty where their productivity is decreasing or remaining flat, or they're not performing or maybe as engaged as you would like them to be. And so do you really want to offer them a compensation bump? Maybe, maybe not, but weighting all of these factors can help to make that decision. The last thing I'll talk about is we do have some clients that use a rolling average of the benchmark data, 2 years, 3 years maybe, which can help smooth out some of the ups and downs in the survey data. But what we would recommend is taking a look at all of these factors and not just the rate of inflation. Lyle, I'll turn it back over to you for the next question.
So question number 3, and I loved the way one of our listeners worded this particular question. How do you navigate rising sign-in bonuses in competitive markets without busting the budget? And so here, again, a little bit of perspective that we wanted to provide. You can see, and this is a little bit of MGMA data, the average bonuses for physicians are somewhere in the $20,000 to $25,000 range. I think that's pretty traditional from our perspective. Not all specialties, certainly, and we've even seen these numbers go up into the 6-figure range under certain circumstances. But I'll also note too, we continue to see these bonuses really grow every single year, and we calculated from 2019-2020 to current date a CAGR, or a combined annual growth rate, of about 10%. So they're growing significantly every year as well. And I think practically what happens here is you've got one organization that may pay, let's just say X 1 year, and then your competitor across town will raise whatever you paid by about $2,500 or maybe even $5,000, and then it just kind of goes back and forth until they continue to increase to some substantive manner. And these are big budget items. If you think about it for just a moment, if you just take 10 physicians at $25,000 a piece, that's $250,000. So this is a significant issue that we know a lot of you all are dealing with here. So to provide a little bit of perspective and color commentary on kind of talking about when signing bonuses are paid, to start with, like most things, you need a really well-developed strategy and And I think it needs to be fair. It needs to be consistently applied. It needs to be based on predetermined criteria, and it needs to have a cap. And I think you need to kind of have these things out there before you get into the heat of the moment, so that you've got some organizational buy-in to why you're doing what you're doing, and perhaps, you know, when it's time to kind of tap out of the discussions with the physician. You know, on top of this strategy, you know, I think you need to consider deploying a number of different tactics, and you'll see many of those that are on here. You may want to utilize the payback provisions for assigning bonuses. And so again, I think that what that means is you may be more than willing to pay the actual amount of the bonus up front, but if they leave before a certain term, then they have to pay back a pro rata portion. We see this applied very often in agreements that we look at. I'd say close to maybe 90% of the arrangements that we look at, when they make the decision to pay a signing bonus, have this payback provision in them. We're also seeing clients kind of carve the signing bonus out of the base compensation. And so what I mean by that is you might have, say, a $30,000 signing bonus, which may have a payback provision over 3 years. So effectively $10,000 per year. We're seeing some clients lower the base compensation by $10,000 to help balance the budgetary constraints that may be there. Doesn't work in all circumstances, but can be helpful. Certainly, we're seeing clients negotiate longer agreement terms. So in some instances, again, doesn't work in all cases, but perhaps in a community where there is a significant demand for a specialty, instead of sort of having that agreement term be 3 years, now it's going to be 5 years. And of course, if you do that, you want to make sure the termination provisions and subject for fair market value commercial reasonableness can have appropriate check-ins there. But it can be done over the course of the agreement. And then finally, you know, balancing kind of these signing bonuses with alternative recruitment strategies and tactics. We know signing bonuses are not the only thing that physicians are interested in. And so you've got sort of an arsenal of options here. You've got relocation assistance, for example. We see this very, very commonly paid across our clients, maybe 80–90% of them. Of course, if they're moving, this is if physicians are moving out of town into town, not necessarily paying this when physicians are in town already. You know, something like $10,000 is probably the most common amount that we see paid for those types of numbers. But again, plus or minus given facts and circumstances. Student loan forgiveness as well is one. We don't see this as nearly as frequent, but you know, something like maybe $20,000 over a 4-year period. That's not too uncommon in our experience. The residency and the fellowship stipend can be used as well. What I like about this option, again, when it's appropriate, is if you're trying to time the payment of these amounts that are going to physicians for any sort of startup expense, you may be able to pay these while the physicians are still in their residency or their fellowship, and then have them kind of pay that back over the term of the agreement when it actually begins. So you can time it a little bit different than your standard starting bonus as to when that's paid, and that can be helpful from a cash flow perspective. Then finally, income guarantee. The reality, of course, is some physicians, if they can get an income guarantee, that means less risk to them. They know what to expect for their compensation levels. And so because of that, they may very well be willing to accept a lower signing bonus if they know what level of compensation they can expect over a certain period. So some of those may go without no signing bonus, and some may go with a lower signing bonus. So that's always an option to be considering too. So Aaron, I'll pause here and turn it over to you for question 4.
So this question 4 is not a new question by any means, but we see it frequently enough that we wanted to include it here. So how do you compensate providers who are extremely productive or unproductive? So we're going to start this answer off from a work RVU perspective. So thinking about providers who are compensated based on their work RVUs. We understand that that's not the total perspective on this question, but as Lyle mentioned earlier, there's still a majority of physicians being compensated based on work RVUs. So we're going to start there. We're going to think about a little bit some fair market value concerns and how to align compensation and productivity, as well as some operational questions that you may want to be thinking about. So as we start, we want to talk about the inverse relationship between compensation and compensation per work RVU. So there's a lot going on this graph, but I want to walk through it. So if we start on the left side, you'll see the compensation per work RVU axis. On the right side is the total compensation axis. And then along the bottom are the percentiles of work RVUs. So as you move left to right, it's providers that are less to more productive. So if we start on the left side at the 25th percentile, so those are your relatively low producers, as we trace our way up, you'll see on the green line that those providers are earning about $400,000. And this is an example for general surgery. So they're earning about $400,000. And if you keep going up to the blue line, they're earning it at a rate of about $75 per work RVU. In contrast, if you look at the right side at the 90th percentile, so our high producers, trace our way up to the green line, they're earning about $700,000 in total compensation, but they're earning it at a per work RVU rate of about $63 or so. And so this shows the high producers, yes, are earning more in total compensation, but they're earning it at a lower per work RVU rate. And the reason for that is if they were earning it at the same rate, their total compensation would be much higher and off the scales of what might be reasonable. So this is really important to think about when you have providers that are compensated on a work RVU basis. When we think about highly productive providers, we really want to understand why they're so productive. So is their level of annual work RVUs reasonable? We have providers that maybe work more than a 1.0 FTE. We've seen 1.5, but as you start getting up into those levels, you want to make sure that they're still providing the same level of quality and there's nothing else coming into question. We've had some clients do time studies for really highly productive providers. You want to look at and make sure that all their services are personally performed. So if we think about advanced practice providers, are we really capturing just the physician's personally performed services, accounting for any incident to or split shared services that might be happening? Chart reviews here. One thing we can do to test really high producers is look at national coding distributions. So you might take a physician's utilization, look at their E&M visits, and if you have a physician that's coding 75% level 5 visits, and the national distribution is 50% at that level for their specialty, it might warrant digging deeper and doing a chart review. A couple ways to address this from a compensation perspective is considering a compensation or work RVU cap. And what that means for the work RVU side is paying either a productivity bonus or an amount per work RVU up to a certain work RVU level. So when they hit 10,000 work RVUs or 12,000 work RVUs, that cap kicks in. So you're kind of protecting yourself on the high end of compensation. Same thing for the compensation cap. We see this most often tied to some survey data. So if you hit the 90th percentile, there may be a soft cap, which means it'll be reviewed to ensure it's reasonable. And then lastly, you can always introduce quality metrics. So coming away from work RVUs and all of the noise associated with that, and measure or compensate based on quality. To talk about the other side, unproductive providers, again, we want to understand why. Is it a new physician? We can see, a year or 2 years of ramp up for a physician, depending on what kind of market they're in to get to full productivity. Is the physician in a really niche specialty or subspecialty? Are they spending a lot of time providing these services that's maybe not reflected in the work RVUs? This is where a provider needs assessment can be really helpful. It can show you the supply and demand in a specific specialty and a specific market, and that can be important for documentation and risk purposes. Things to consider here from compensation is a work RVU floor, which, like the cap, but kind of the opposite. If a provider doesn't produce to a certain level, you may go back and adjust their base compensation. And then a full production model, which just says that you'll pay them based on their work RVUs provided, and that can make sure that compensation and productivity are aligned. Lastly, it might just be a tough conversation if you have a provider that's not ramping up as expected or nearing retirement. It may be a conversation to have once you get some answers to these questions here. That wraps up all of our questions. Again, thank you for joining us. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And I'm going to turn it back over to the moderator to wrap us up.
Thank you for listening to this PYA webinar recast. The video recording, slides, and associated material for this and all PYA webinars are available on our website. If you have any questions or if we can help, please contact us at pyapc.com. Thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.